Chapter 28. They stayed on for 2 days at the Cogline trading centre, waiting for Roan to regain strength enough to resume the journey east. The fever was gone by morning and the Highlander was resting comfortably, but he was still entirely too weak to attempt to travel. So Bryn asked permission of the trader Steb to keep the use of the tack room for 1 day more, and the trader agreed. He provided them with food for their meals, rations of ale, medicines and blankets, but he refused quickly all offers of payment. He was happy to be of help to them, he assured the Vale girl, but he was uneasy in her presence, and he never quite managed to let his eyes meet hers. Bryn understood well enough what was happening. The trader was a kind and decent man, but now he was frightened of her and what she might do to him if he refused it. He would probably have helped her out of his basic generosity, but fear had added urgency to his impulse. He obviously felt that this was the quickest and most expedient way to get her out of his life. She remained for the most part within the confines of the little tack room with Roan, seeing to his needs and talking with him of what had befallen him since the death of Eleanor. Talking about it seemed to help, while both were still stunned by what had happened. The sharing of their feelings brought forth a common determination that they must go forward to complete the quest that the Druid had left to them. A new closeness developed between them, stronger and more certain in its purpose. With the death of Eleanor, they now had only each other upon whom to rely, and each felt new value in the other's presence. Alone together in the solitude of their tiny room at the rear of the trader's stables, they spoke in hushed tones of the choices that had been made to bring them to this point in their lives, and of those that must yet be made. Slowly, surely, they bound themselves as one. Yet despite their binding together in spirit and cause, there remained some things of which Bryn could not bring herself to speak, even to Roan Lee. She could not tell him of the blood that Eleanor had taken from his own ravaged body to place upon her, blood that in some way was meant to pledge her to him, even in death. Nor could she tell Roan of the uses to which she had put the Wishsong, once in fury to destroy human life, a second time in desperation to save it. She could speak of none of these things to the Highlander, in part because she did not fully understand them, in part because of the implications frightened her so greatly that she was not sure what she wanted to. The blood oath was too remote in purpose now for her to dwell upon, and the uses of the Wishsong were the result of emotions that she promised herself she would not let get away from her again. There was another reason for not speaking to Roan of these things. The Highlander was troubled enough as matters stood by the loss of the Sword of Lee, so troubled in fact that he could seem to think of little else. He meant to have that sword back again, he told her over and over. He would search it out and reclaim it, whatever the cost. His insistence frightened her, for he seemed to have bound himself to the sword with such need that it was as if the weapon had somehow become a part of him. Without it, she guessed, the Highlander did not believe that he could survive what lay ahead. Roan felt that without it, he must surely be lost. All the while she listened to him talk of this and thought about how deeply he seemed now to depend on the magic of the blade. She pondered as well her own dependence on the Wishsong. It was just a toy, she had always told herself, but that was a lie. It was anything but a toy. It was magic every bit as dangerous as they contained in the missing Sword of Lee. It could kill. It was, in fact, what her father had always said, a birthright that she would have been better off without. Eleanor had warned her as he lay dying. The power of the Wishsong is like nothing I have ever seen, the words whispered darkly as she listened to Roan. Power to heal, power to destroy. She had seen them both. Must she be as dependent on the magic as Roan now seemed to be? Between her and the elven magic, she was to be master. Her father had fought his own battle to discover the answer to that question, she knew. He had fought it when he had struggled to overcome his inability to master the power of the magic contained within the Elfstones. He had done so, survived the staggering forces it had unleashed within him, and then cast it aside forever. Yet his brief use of the power had exacted its price, a transmutation of the magic from the Elfstones to his children. So now perhaps the battle must be fought yet another time. But what if this time the power could not be controlled? The second day drifted into night. The Veil Girl and the Highlander ate the meal brought to them by the trader and watched the darkness deepen. When Roan had gone weary and rolled into his blankets to sleep, Bryn slipped out into the cool autumn night to breathe smells that were sharp and clean, and to lose herself for a time in skies grown bright with a crescent moon and stars. On her way past the trading centre, she caught sight of the trader as he sat smoking his pipe on the empty veranda, his high-backed chair tilted against the rail. No one had come by for drinks or talk that evening, so he sat alone. Quietly she walked over to him. "Evening," he greeted hastily, sitting forward a bit too quickly in the chair, almost as if he was poised to flee. Bryn nodded. "We will be leaving in the morning," she informed him, and thought she detected a look of immediate relief in his dark eyes. "But I wanted to thank you first for your help." He shook his head. No need." He paused, brushing back his thinning hair. "I'll see to it that you have everything and supplies to get you through the first few days or so." Bryn didn't argue. It was pointless to do anything other than simply to accept what was offered. "Would you have an ashbow?" she asked, thinking suddenly of Roan. "One that could be used for hunting when we—" "Ashbow? Got one right here, as a matter of fact." The trader was on his feet at once. He ducked through the doorway leading into the centre and emerged a moment later with a bow and a quiver of arrows. "You take these," he pressed. "No charge, of course. But solid weapons. Belong to you anyway, since they were dropped by those fellas you chased off." He caught himself and cleared his throat self-consciously. "Anyway, you take them," he finished. He set them down in front of her and dropped back into his chair, fingers drumming nervously on wooden arm. Bryn picked up the bow and arrows. "They don't really belong to me, you know," she said quietly. "Especially not because of what happened." The trader looked down at his feet. "Don't belong to me either. You take them, girl." There was a long silence. The trader stared past her resolutely into the dark. Bryn shook her head. "Do you know anything of the country east of here?" she asked him. He kept his eyes turned away. "Not much. It's bad country." "Is there anybody who might know?" The trader didn't answer. "What about the woodsman who was here the other night?" "Yef." The trader was silent for a moment. "Oh, I suppose. He's been a lot of places." How would I find him?" she pressed, growing increasingly uncomfortable with the man's reticence. The trader's brows knotted. He was thinking about what an answer he should give her. Finally, he looked directly at her. You don't mean to harm him, do you, girl?" Prince stared at him sadly for a moment, then shook her head. "No, I don't mean to harm him." The trader studied her for a moment, then looked away. He's a friend, you see. Then he pointed out toward the charred rush. He's got a camp a few miles downriver. South Bank. Bryn nodded. She started to turn away, then stopped. I am the same person I was when you helped me that first night, she said quietly. Leather boots scuffed against the wooden planks of the porch. Oh, maybe. It just don't seem that way to me, came the response. Her mouth tightened. You don't have to be afraid of me, you know. You really don't. The boots went still and the trader looked down at them. I'm not afraid, he said, his voice low. She waited a moment longer, searching futilely for something more to say, then turned and walked into the dark. The following morning, shortly after daybreak, Bryn and Roan departed to the Darklin trading centre for the country that lay east. Carrying foodstuffs, blankets and the bow supplied by the trader, they bade the anxious man farewell and disappeared into the trees. It was a bright, warm day that greeted them as they made their way downriver along the south bank of the charred rush. The air was filled with the sounds of forest life and the smell of drying leaves. A west wind blew gently out of the distant Wishsong, and leaves drifted eastward in lazy spirals to lie thick upon the forest ground. Through the trees the land ahead could be seen to run on in a gentle sloping of rises and vales. Squirrels and chipmunks scattered and darted away at the sound of their approach, interrupted in their preparations for a winter that seemed far distant from this day. At mid-morning, Vale Girl and Highlander paused to rest for a time, sitting side by side on an old log, hollowed out and worm-eaten with age. In front of them, barely a dozen yards distant, the charred rush flowed steadily eastward into the deeper Nar, and as grass, deadwood debris that was washed down from out of the high country, twisted and turned in intricate patterns. It's still hard for me to believe that he's really gone, Roan said after a time, eyes gazing out across the river. Bryn didn't have to ask whom he meant. For me too, she acknowledged softly. I sometimes think that he really isn't gone at all, that I was mistaken in what I saw, that if I am patient, he will come back, just as he always has. Would that be so strange? Roan mused. Would it be so surprising if Al-Anon do exactly that? The Vale Girl looked at him. He is dead, Roan. Roan kept his face turned away but nodded. I know you. He was quiet for a moment before continuing. Do you think that there was anything that could have been done to save him, Bryn? He looked at the girl then. He was asking her if there was anything that he could have done. Bryn's smile was quick and bitter. No, Roan. He knew that he was going to die. He was told that he would not complete this quest. He had accepted the inevitability of that, I think. Roan shook his head. I would not have done so. Nor I suppose, Bryn agreed. Perhaps that was why he chose to tell us nothing of what was to happen. And perhaps his acceptance is something we cannot hope to understand, because we could never hope to understand him. The Highlander leaned forward and his arms braced against his outstretched legs. So the last of the Druids disappears from the land, and there is no one left to stand against the walkers except you and me. He shook his head hopelessly. Poor us. Bryn glanced down self-consciously at her hands folded in her lap before her. She remembered Al-Anon touching her forehead with his blood as he lay dying, and she shivered with the memory. Poor us, she echoed softly. They rested for a few minutes longer, then resumed their journey east. Barely an hour later they crossed a shallow gravel-bottomed stream that meandered lazily away from the swifter flow of the main channel of the charred rush, back along a worn gully They caught sight of a single-room cabin that sat back in amongst the forest trees, built from hand-cut logs, laid crosswire and chalked with mortar. The little home was settled in a clearing upon a small rise that formed a threshold to a series of low hills, sloping gently away into the forest. A handful of sheep and goats and a single cow grazed in the timber behind the cabin. At the sound of their approach, an aged hunting dog rose from his favourite napping spot next to the cabin stoop and stretched contentedly. The woodman Jeff stood at the far side of the little clearing, stripped to the waist as he cut firewood. With a sure practiced swing downward of the long-handled axe, he split the piece of timber that stood upright on the worn stump that served as a chopping block. Working the embedded blade free, he brushed aside the cloven halves before pausing in his work to watch his visitors approach. Lowering the axe head to the stump, he rested his gnarled hands on the smooth butt of the handle and waited. "Morning," Bryn greeted as they came up to him. "Morning," the woodman replied, nodding. He seemed not at all surprised that they were there, and glanced at Roan. "Feeling better, boy?" "Much," Roan answered. "Thanks in part to you, I'm told." The woodman shrugged. The muscles on his powerful body knotted. He gestured toward the cabin. "There's drinking water on the stoop in that bucket. I bring it fresh from the hills and back each day." He led them down to the cabin porch and the promised bucket. All three took a long drink. Then they seated themselves on the stoop, and the woodman produced a pipe and tobacco. He offered the pouch to his guests, but they declined. So he packed a bowl of his own pipe and began to smoke. "Everything fine back at the trading centre?" he asked casually. There was silence. "I heard about what happened the other night with that bunch from Spanning Ridge country." His eyes shifted slowly to Bryn. "Word has a way of getting around a lot quicker than you'd think out here." The Vale girl held his gaze, ignoring her discomfort. "The trader told us where to find you," she informed him. "He said you might be able to help us." The woodman puffed on the pipe. "In what way?" "He told us that you know as much as anyone about this country." "I've been here a long time," the man agreed. Bryn leaned forward. "We are already in your debt for what you did to help us back at the trading centre. But we need your help again. We need to find a way through the country that lies east of here." The woodman stared at her sharply, then slowly removed the pipe from between his teeth. "East of here? You mean Darklin Reach?" Both Valgo and Highlander nodded. The woodsman shook his head doubtfully. "That's dangerous country. No one goes into Darklin Reach if they can avoid it." He glanced up. "How far do you plan to go?" "All the way," Bryn said quietly. "And then into Olden Moor and the Ravenshorn." "You're mad as jays," the woodman announced matter-of-factly, and knocked the ashes from the pipe, grinding them into the earth with his boot. "Gnomes and walkers and worse own that country. You'll never come out alive." There was no reply. The woodsman studied their faces in turn, rubbed his bearded chin thoughtfully, and finally shrugged. "Guess you've got your reasons for doing this, and it's none of my business what they are. But I'm telling you here and now that you're making a big mistake. Maybe the biggest mistake you'll ever make. Even the trappers stay clear of that country. Men disappear up there like smoke, gone without a trace." He waited for a reply. Bryn glanced briefly at Rome, and then back at the woodsman once more. "We have to go." Can you help us? The woodman grinned crookedly and shook his head. Not me, girl. Even if I was to go with you, which I won't, because I like living, I'd be lost myself after the first day or so. He paused, studying them shrewdly. I suppose you're set on this. Bryn nodded wordlessly, waiting. The woodsman sighed. Maybe there's someone else who can help you then, if you're sure this is what you want. He blew sharply through the stem of his pipe to clean it, then folded his arms across his broad shoulder. There's an old man named Cogline. Must be 90 by now, if he's still alive. I haven't seen him for almost 2 years, so I can't be sure if he's even there anymore. 2 years ago, though, he was living up around a rock formation called Hearthstone. That sits right in the middle of Darklin Reach. Formation that looks just like a big chimney. He shook his head doubtfully. I can give you directions, but the trails aren't much. That's wild country. Hardly anything human living this far east that isn't known. Do you think he will help us? Bryn pressed anxiously. The woodsman shrugged. He knows the country. He's lived there all his life. Doesn't bother coming out more than once a year or so. Not even that. The last two. Stays alive somehow in that jungle. The heavy brows lifted. He's an old duck, old Cogline. Crazier than a fish swimming through grass. He might be more trouble than help to you. We'll be all right, Bryn assured him. Maybe. The woodman looked at her carefully. You're a pretty thing to be wandering off into that country, girl. Even with your singing to protect you, there's more than thieves and cowards out there. I'd think on this before you go any further with it. We have thought. Bryn came to her feet. We're decided. The woodsman nodded. You're welcome to take with you all the water you can carry then. At least you won't die of thirst. He helped them refill their water pouches, carrying a fresh bucket of water from the spring that ran down out of the hills behind their cabin, then took several minutes more to give them the directions they needed to reach Hearthstone. Scratching a crude map in the earth before the stoop. Look after yourselves, he admonished, offering each a firm handshake. With a final word of farewell, Bryn and Roan hitched up their provisions across their backs and walked slowly from the little cabin into the trees. Behind them, the woodsman stood watching. It was clear from the look on his bearded face that he did not expect to see them pass that way again.